The issue that we need to reflect is an issue which is not confined to theoretical analysis of prescriptions. It is very close and dear to my heart, and something that I passionately believe in. Now, when I was asked after 6 years of solitary confinement in Malaysian prison, what have I learned, having to reflect and meditate and devour books in the 6 years. It is my strong passion for freedom, and I am in no position to either compromise or concede on the importance of democracy in Malaysia, the Muslim world, or throughout the world. About 4 months ago, in a speech at the United Nations University, Tokyo, I alluded to the strong and lively social, political, cultural, and intellectual movement in Muslim societies. I call this movement the Great Wave of Democratic Islam. Now, the quest for democracy among Muslims today is one of the most prominent and transforming features of our time. The Muslim world missed the boat in an earlier democratic wave that brought down the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Eastern Europe from communism, and the implosion of the Soviet Empire. We had to wait almost a decade later, with the onset of the Asian financial crisis, that Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, finally broke itself free from the yoke of a military-based authoritarianism. What happened in Indonesia in 1997 is one of the most decisive moments in Islam's modern history. What is happening in Turkey is no less remarkable. If Indonesia has the prestige of being the largest Muslim country, Turkey is remembered among Muslims as a seat of their last empire as well as caliphate. Turkey came into being a modern state with an avowed secular character under Mustafa Kemal. However, it is Turkey's fundamental contradiction that until recently its secular character was maintained not by popular consent but by military force. But the current government, with a clear democratic mandate, Turkey is undoubtedly one of the most vibrant and mature Muslim democracies. It is within this democratic mode that the nation wants to refresh its collective memory of its cultural identity, to mature as a democracy but retain its Muslim identity. The current trend in the Muslim world has its historical antecedent. One historian, Eric Hobsbawm, has called the 20th century the age of extremes. Despite so much fear and prejudices towards fundamentalists of all religious persuasion, the worst crime against humanity are all committed by godless fanatics: Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot. But the 20th century for the Muslim was a century of great hopes. Unfortunately, it was also a century of great betrayal. The great expectations of the last century issued from the achievement of national liberation. Muslim countries, one after another, freed themselves from colonial tutelage. Algeria from the French, Indonesia from the Dutch, Libya from the Italians, and others from the British, too many to mention. Perhaps it is more than a coincidence that Indonesia organized the Bandung Conference in 1955, the unprecedented and unsurpassed assembly of leaders of the Third World Liberation Movements, notably Chow En-lai, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sukarno, and others. I can still recall Sukarno's mesmerizing oratory, which I listened clandestinely in the early 60s, at the time when Indonesia launched its confrontation against Malaysia, dubbed as a neo-colonialist state. But I later came to learn that it was Sukarno, the secular nationalist, that botched Indonesia's constitutional democracy, that had conducted a free and fair elections in 1955. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, at that time was perhaps the most loved foreign leader among Muslims in Southeast Asia. That affection is well placed, as I later read of Jinnah's commitments towards democracy, his horror against corruption, and his stern warning that the army should never leave their barracks. Musharraf needs to be reminded. Unfortunately, Jinnah did not live long to lead Pakistan as a civilian and democratic Muslim state. After his death, Pakistanis unfailing and differentially referred to him as Qaid al-Azam, the great leader. But his ideals of good governance and democracy is yet to be realized. In my country, Malaysia, when independence was achieved in 1957, it was stated in the Declaration of Independence that the new sovereign nation is founded on the principles of justice and freedom. I think a summary somewhat of Jeffersonian ideals. We will never claim that to be true. Unfortunately, the principles of justice and freedom were forgotten, and the provisions of fundamental liberties enshrined in the Constitution were progressively compromised and eroded by the ruling clique. So when we speak of the future of democracy in the Muslim world, we must acknowledge its roots in Muslim societies, that fair, free elections is not something unusual. It has been practiced in the past. It has been hijacked by authoritarian leaders, the dictators, the Ba'athis, and the rest. We have also to acknowledge that the battle cry of our freedom fighters, founding fathers, or liberation fighters were democracy, freedom, justice. From Sun Yat-sen in China to Sukarno Hatta in Indonesia, Ali Jinnah in India, and hundreds others in the Middle East. Their sacred oath was to establish an independent and democratic nation. There is a great intellectual movement, as I had alluded to earlier, on the rise in the Muslim world, increasing the store of ideas that will inspire change in the present and in the future. Even among Muslims and the so-called Islamists, freedom is considered one of the higher objectives of the divine law, the Maqasid Sharia, reverberating through societies, providing the moral basis upon which the institutions of democracy and civil society and justice to be established. And this include the freedom of conscience, freedom to speak out against tyranny, the call for reform, and the right to property. Only the autocrats and the authoritarian leaders seem to create a perception that democracy is something alien, as a Western agenda imposed by the administration in Washington and orchestrated by the NED. But the desire to be free is universal. It's neither East nor West, Islam or Christian or Judaism. It is a universal concern. It is a moral imperative to my mind. The Islamic intellectual tradition is replete with incidences of ulama or religious scholars chastising the unjust and corrupt leaders. The tradition of dissent, or what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen persuasively argued as the argumentative tradition, although he confined it as the argumentative Indian, is always present in Muslim cultural history. The birth of democratic impulse among the Muslims came at the same time with the birth of movement for reform and renewal of religion and society more than 2 centuries ago. Our time does not permit me to say enough to do justice to the rich current and cross current of ideas used by the religious scholars, journalists, reformists, men, women in the 19th and early 20th century that provided today's Muslims with a store of reform and democratic ideas. Now, the criticism of Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi of the Ottoman Empire's despotic rule, Rifa'at Tahtawi's admiration of French democratic institutions, recently translated under the title An Imam in Paris. It reminds me of a great Hindi movie, An Evening in Paris, or probably Marlon Brando's Last Tango in Paris. Or Taha Hussein's lucid exposition of Mustaqbal Thaqafah fil Misr, future of Egyptian culture, and letters of a 19th century Javanese princess, Raden Kartini, From Darkness to Light, long before the feminist writings surfaced. These provided a constellation of ideas and infused motives and desires that can only be fulfilled by the establishment of a free and democratic society. It is the human desire to be free, to live a dignified life and abhorrence towards despotism and oppression that motivate the Muslims, be they Arabs, Malays, Persians, or Africans, to crave for democracy. Their desire has been nurtured, accumulated, and betrayed, but now gaining an unprecedented momentum. It is based on this desire that I believe that Muslims and Americans are natural partners. It is an alliance that can and must be forged to make the world once again secure for democracy. This is not necessarily a very popular statement to make, to assume that Muslims and Americans can be partners. Certainly not these days. But if you look at the historical perspective of the liberation struggles, the Americans were there. You look at the role that the Moroccans played, the first country to recognize the United States after the War of Independence. And and again, prior to this war on terror, the war against militant communists, the Muslims, the general Muslim masses were with the Americans. I was a student at the University of Malaya at the height of the Vietnam War. Yes, we were against American bombings in Vietnam, but we were at the same time concerned, worried, scared to death in case the communists were able to continue their aggressive designs and the domino theory actually worked. So there was always this contradiction and the dilemma faced by many of us. So there is an opposition, a strong opposition against American aggression, but a strong support for American policies against the communists. And I think this reverberates well when we consider the issue in Iraq. A strong opposition against dictatorial, repressive rule by Saddam Hussein and others. But at the same time, against any aggressive design and war perpetrated by United Nations, by America against these countries. What is left is therefore a concerted effort to influence the direction of policies in these societies. Let us look at Egypt, for example, who is a great beneficiary of American aid, second to Israel, but acting on issues of governance, repression, and corruption with impunity. And you can then appreciate the disgust, the utter perplexity felt by many Muslims against the so-called contradiction and hypocrisy of the American policy. When Secretary Condoleezza Rice came up with this firm, categorical statement on the need for democracy and reform in Egypt, it's widely reported and supported by Muslim masses. Of course, objected to by the authoritarian leaders. But when we see almost 1,000 arrested and repression by Mubarak, and hardly anything done by the United States administration other than some normal platitudes on the need for reform, etc. This, of course, caused a lot of consternation among Muslims. Now let me come back to the issue on the war on terror. I never equivocate on terrorism and find great difficulty in trying to understand people who gives a lot of rationality, rationale why terrorists surface, why we can appreciate because of poverty, because marginalization, etc. I think we can deal with them separately. But we must confine the issue of terrorism as a problem. And we need to support strong and effective measures to defeat the terrorists. Having said that, I must say that the manner it is conducted, at least in some aspects, is patently unwise. The net has been cast rather too widely. Civil liberties compromised. And here in the United States, there's a growing evidence that innocent Muslims continue to be harassed. Malaysia, my country, successfully fought the militant communists. What the government did then, of course, it started with the British colonial masters and later followed by the independent government, was to isolate the communists and win over the hearts and minds of the rest of the population. Most of the communists were Malaysian or Chinese, Malaysians of Chinese origins. I repeat, virtually all the militant communists then were Chinese, Malaysians of Chinese origins. But we never call them Chinese communists. We simply call them militant communists. Because the majority of Malaysians of Chinese origins were not communists, were not even supportive of communist activities, and did not condone the excesses of the militant communists. But here in the war against terror, we have the perception that the war is being waged not only against genuine terrorists, but also groups arbitrarily named as jihadis, Wahhabis, Salafis, Madrasa, and you name it. I disagree with many of the ideas and views of the Wahhabis and Salafis. Let me categorically state that. As many good Christians strongly disagree with some of the views of the Christian fundamentalists here and elsewhere. But this is a separate issue. The debate, the polemics should continue. But in the war on terror, it is ludicrous to cast the net wide open and to engulf those who are neither perpetrators or purveyors of criminal acts of terror. And I think why it is relevant in our discourse today, because it complicates the issue. It makes the entire struggle for democracy and reform in the Muslim world more difficult. So the future of Muslim democracy, therefore, is right now. The emergence of Muslim democracies beyond a mere theoretical exercise as a fact and reality on the ground is something significant and worth our attention. We are making the rules as we go. And as T.S. Eliot once wrote, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. And time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. Now, of course, there are concerns which will be discussed, because the parties, some Islamic parties or Muslim parties participating in the democratic process now were known to be clear, strong advocates of a theocracy. Then they revised a theo-democracy, whatever it meant. But they mature in the process. My limited experience in Malaysia, I'm working in a coalition of forces, the liberal right and the Islamic Party and the Justice Party. Now, of course, Carl referred to the rally, yes, but we had a lot of constraints, a lot of roadblocks, and I was given clear warnings and threatened before the speech. Our worry has always been not that we do not have freedom of speech. All countries have. Under Saddam, you have freedom of speech. In Malaysia, you have freedom of speech. But you don't have freedom after speech. That's a problem. So the key word is, of course, engagement. We must have the courage of conviction and the courage to engage. It is, to my mind, totally unacceptable for us to continue to marginalize groups because of their perceived views, either against the West or against other parties. To my mind, it is essential because, again, in my limited experience with the Islamic Party, which were known to be strong advocates of Islamic law, even in Islamic State. Now, Islamic State is no longer in the agenda. Now, the concern again is, what happens if it is one man, one vote, one time? And I think the fear is real, not only among non-Muslims, but also some Muslims in Malaysia. So they kept on cautioning me, Anwar, look, what happens next? I said, then we must have institutions, civil society in place, not just free and fair elections like you observe in Egypt. You must have the rule of law, the institutions of society, and a free media. Without a free media, the elections is rendered irrelevant. And we do not have a free media in Malaysia, for your information, because according to Freedom Index, ours is number 151, close to Cuba and Libya. And still we have somewhat fair elections. How come you be fair when you don't have a free media? And that is what Carl needs to see. Now, let me conclude by saying that pluralism and diversity has its own legitimacy within Islam. It's a tradition attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that divergent of opinions among scholars is a rahmah, is a blessing. In fact, the four schools of law in Islam, the Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Hanbali, notwithstanding the Shia, 12ers, Ithna Ash'ari, these great founding juries refused to have their school adopted by the government of their day as the official school of law. Many of them were imprisoned as a process, as a result. What is less known in the West, including the United States, is that among the traditional scholars, the tradition of free inquiry and dissent still continue. They continue to work to increase the store of ideas that support democracy and support freedom and free market. They also have been fighting for freedom and justice, and some have suffered immensely. They are also allies and partners, not only the liberal elite, and this is of course a mistake to my mind of many of us here in the United States. You engage with only the so-called liberal elites. You ignore the leaders who muster the support of the majority of the Muslim public. I would, of course, call, as I have mentioned in a number of sessions with NED, that you need to engage. But the universal principles must be made clear. In no way we will compromise on the issue of freedom and democracy and a free market economy, because these are fundamental issues. And constitutional guarantees must be in place. Institutions of civil society must be supported. And I think this certainly ways, mechanisms, how we could then march forward in this reform agenda and march towards democracy. Thank you.
We have some time. We're going to go over the limit because we started late, so we have some good time for questions. So maybe I'll ask you to identify yourself before you ask the question. I think we have microphones on both sides. Are they going to be staying there, or are they going to be floating? Okay. Why don't you give the mic over here, please?
Hi, Alex Bueno-Edwards, NYU School of Law. I have a question for you, and my question is, on the agenda of freedom that you speak of in the search for Muslim democracy, I mean, you've mentioned Turkey certainly as an advancing light in the democratic Muslim world, but even in Turkey, there is very circumscribed freedom of conscience for non-Muslims, one could argue. Certainly there's not any liberty for people who are Muslim to convert to another religion. And surely that must be considered as a fundamental freedom, not to have to be a Muslim for life, right? So, but even in a country like Turkey, that's nowhere near on the agenda. So where does that fall in this search for democracy, that the actual freedom of conscience to not be Muslim anymore in a majority Muslim state?
Now, the advance that you have seen in Turkey is not only indigenous or in character, but also because of the engagement with the EU. This is, to my mind, very critical. It has helped the ruling party and the liberal elements in Turkey to navigate through these pressures from EU, which is not confined to Turkey, but there are standard agreements that apply to all EU members, those that have applied or wish to be members of EU. And to my mind, this is of enormous assistance in the maturing process and towards reform in Turkey. Secondly, you must also realize that the military establishment is a major factor and still have an immense influence and pressure against democratic leadership in Turkey. And it is only through the EU pressure, and I believe to a large extent American pressure, that you can then manage to confine the military establishment in their barracks. But specifically on the issue of conversion, I think it's also internal dynamics and debate within the Muslim communities. I mean, there is a debate in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Turkey, and in the Middle East that I'm aware of. In fact, there is recent publication by the IIIT, Islamic Thought, by Sheikh Taha, that made this strong reference to this, that the issue of death penalty for those Muslims who convert to other religions is not tenable in law. And I mean, for example, you find this sort of arguments surfacing. But I wouldn't, for purely practical considerations, to go on these specific moves and sacrifice the general reform and agenda and freedom in the societies. And I think we have to smartly navigate your way and get this debate across, so that Muslims in Turkey and elsewhere are aware. But this is one example. Like gender issues, there's still some who speaks strongly on the issue of two female versus one male witness in courts. I mean, many classical scholars and known religious scholars have debunked this thesis. But this is, of course, a growing, I say, debate, and it is within the internal dynamics of Muslim discourse.
Is there over here?
Hi, my name is John Bader, and I had a question about what's needed specifically to translate some of these cultural traditions or heritage supporting democracy in the Muslim world to actually translate into actual democracy and steps towards democracy that we've seen in Indonesia and a few other countries.
There's been a lot of work in this direction. I've just been shown a recent publication by CSID here in the States on the specific proposals on the issue of reform of the media, of elections, of independent judiciary. In fact, I have personally also suggested to the NED to support a major effort in the major translation efforts of the great works on Tocqueville, by Tocqueville or Jefferson, because once Muslims read this text, there's very little, I mean, that we can disagree about. I mean, I find no disagreement. I mean, habits of the heart, of intermediate associations, and tyranny of the majority, the caution about vox populi, vox dei, certainly is not a democratic principle. These issues need to be made known to the Muslim world. You must realize that, we don't have a free media, excepting for Indonesia, Turkey, and in a limited sense many other countries. So the discourse is dictated by the leadership. And the leadership of these countries, the ruling clique, are in no way supportive of such a venture. It has to be influenced from outside. But the intention is not a crude force of imperialistic design. The intention is, of course, a democratic ideas shared by others. That is why I've always emphasized in Asia that democratic ideas is ideas of Sun Yat-sen in China, or Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru in India, or Jinnah in Pakistan, Sukarno Hatta and the great scholars, in fact classical Muslim scholars in the world. It is important. So we can even tend to try and either reformulate or interpret some of their views, but also translate many of the modern works. But the issue of independent judiciary, the issue of free media, of fair and free elections, I think these are paramount to my education process.
Just as a point of information, when Anwar Ibrahim mentioned CSID, for those of you who don't know, that's a U.S.-based organization called the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. And you might go into their website and you'll see a lot of literature on the very subjects that he is discussing, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Just want to correct something, that Algeria has free press, and a lot of people mention that. It's an Islamic country. I just want to make one comment, is that, it's very interesting when people talk about, countries, such as in Turkey, the freedom to convert and so on, but countries like Turkey and Tunisia are not allowed to have women to wear the hijab in their country, to go to work or to go to parliament. So that's one thing about allowing the so-called democracy, but at the same time not allowing Islam to be practiced fully by their citizens. However, that's just a side note, if you care to answer on that. Just want to ask you, in the Islamic world, Arab and non-Arab, which country do you think has attained full democracy or is closest to it? Thank you.
No, because Turkey tends to be criticized for its intolerance of hijab. The United States is not, the UK is not. Turkey is at least denying members of parliament from wearing a hijab. And this case of the lady member of parliament was dismissed, expelled as a member of parliament for wearing hijab. And these, to my mind, these are issues that need to be resolved, because people show so much intolerance. I mean, as a result, you find the resentment in the Paris riots, the recent riots, because the Muslim in their response would say that you ban us from wearing hijab in schools, but it's okay to wear bikinis in the streets of Paris. So they find it very difficult sort of to understand. There's so much tolerance towards what is considered with the Muslim as permissiveness in moral precepts. I mean, there's so much intolerance towards this. I would suggest that people should be free. You want to wear hijab, you want to wear Saladin style or King Richard style, I mean, fair. You see in New York, my word, I'm enjoying myself because you can see everything here. But of course, there are excesses you can have. The society can make, some suggestions and caution, whatever. I mean, and the family finally will be the final arbiter on the code. It's the family, not governments. Particularly when governments themselves are not too moralistic or too moral. It's like government laws on corruption. The most corrupt will talk about corrupt laws, but that wouldn't mean anything. So I think we need to deal with these issues. And I believe in Turkey, they have to deal with it. But the problem is, of course, the military establishment, because I think they happen to be the bastion of secularism. And it's interesting that the secularism as understood by Mustafa Kemal is far more excessive than secularism in the United States. That is secularism which is anti-religion. Now, secularism should not be understood as to be anti-religion. It should be at least a separation of church and state. It's not against religion. I mean, once you take a position like the Kemalists of Turkey, I mean, it's generally perceived as being anti-religious, and therefore you will have a backlash. That is why so much of propaganda, control, was finally rejected. I mean, in a free and fair elections, this was completely rejected. Now, where in the Muslim world you have full democracy? Well, I think it's a maturing process. I think Indonesia, you have free media, you have independent judiciary, unfortunately quite corrupt. But we have to deal. But then you have the media attacking, criticizing, ferocious criticism of the leadership and the judiciary, which to my mind is a major contribution. Because then you have elections with some phantom members, but they say, I don't know, they say even in Florida you used to have phantom members electing voters. So you actually mature in the process. But I think what is important are the institutions of civil society must be in place. So I am certainly quite optimistic of Indonesia, although they have to rein two issues, economic development and issue of corruption. In Turkey, more promising, because they have the EU, and with the clear ground rules that would help the Turkish leadership to navigate its way and mature in the process.
Please, can we get the mic over here? Thank you.
I'm Gershom Baskin from the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information in Jerusalem. Anwar, I'm curious to know what advice you would give to these maturing democracies in dealing with Islamic fundamentalist parties like Hezbollah and Hamas that on the one hand are thriving to join the democratic process, on the other hand retain their hold on the gun.
Yes. At least I have a good friend from Israel. I think I share the sentiments that the concern is if any organization choose to adopt a democratic process or participate in a democratic process, then they must disband all avenues, the alternative in terms of violence or militant activity. I don't believe, it is tenable to have both at the same time. I think my position on terror is non-negotiable. Therefore, I would certainly say that if Hamas and Hezbollah, the moment they adopt and accept a democratic process and elections, then all militant activities must be ceased. But this also has its relevance on the attitude and the position and policies of Israel to consider the plight of the Palestinians, which you, of course, have articulated very well, and I certainly appreciate that. So I think it has to be both. And whilst the Muslim world must reign in a more forceful manner to condemn any militant or violent activities, but at the same time, I think the international community, including the United States, must also reign on Israel to make sure that there is an amicable solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I think is developing more in a more promising note now than ever before.
Take one over here, and then I see back there. We'll go around. All right, over there, and then go ahead, and then we'll come over here, and then over there.
Thank you. My name is Jen Salen, and I had the opportunity to travel to Malaysia this past summer for 6 weeks. And one of the things I was very interested in was, I think, the diversity of the practice of Islam. And I think this may be a point where I was confused because I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the treatment of Ayah Pin's Sky Kingdom this past summer by the Malaysian government. And I ask this because one of the issues of perhaps what you're referring to at the very end of your talk this evening about diversity and pluralism, can there be pluralism in terms of the practice of Islam, and would Ayah Pin's Sky Kingdom represent that or not?
No, she's referring to this new sect, a small sect that's emerged in Malaysia. They want to create a kingdom of heaven. Not kingdom of heaven that you saw in the movie, in the Hollywood movie, but this is the sky kingdom. But I think there is a limit. I think you must be bound by laws. Otherwise, the illiterate, the semi-literates are being duped by these people. They have supernatural powers. They claim to have supernatural powers. They promise heaven on earth, and they call it Sky Kingdom. And what do you do then? Do you tolerate them because of pluralism and freedom of conscience? I don't believe that should be the case. But how do you then deal with it? I mean, there must be some laws. If you have evidence that these people has been cheated because they were promised heaven on earth, then I think that they should be brought to court. And the judge should ask, where is the heaven? And he claims to have supernatural powers, then probably the judge must ask. Because otherwise it is an attempt to deceive, an issue of deception. And people pay money. And you have very poor farmers, asked to pay money to this so-called religious teacher, Ayah Pen. And I'm not sure how many wives he has, because most of the sects then end up having many wives. Well, then you can always say that it is basic freedom. I mean, if you choose to have 10 wives, your basic right. I think there must be certain laws that must guide, because otherwise, I've seen in my personal experience again many of these sort of cause queer sex. Sex, but then finally it's also sex, and I think we need to have ground rules. Thank you.
Over here, please.
Good evening. My name is Alan Thayer. From my experience, when people in the U.S. and in Europe think of Islam and Islamic thought, that generally leads to the birthplace in the Middle East. But as we recognize, Indonesia being the largest Muslim country, and Malaysia and India and Pakistan, all in Asia, there's a significant trend of Islamic thought that would naturally come from these countries as well. I mean, yourself, Abdul Rahman Wahid, Nurhalis Majid in Indonesia are all thinkers that I respect and have great ideas about Islam and democracy. To what extent do you think that your views and the views of your peers, maybe in Indonesia, are received in other parts of the world, be the Muslim parts of the world or not Muslim parts of the world? I.e., how much influence or how are these views received? Are they respected in the same ways as the thinkers from Egypt and other parts of the Muslim world?
It's a personal question. I can't be presumptuous. I mean, I can't. I'm not sure whether I can win any seats in Malaysia. So I'm not. I can't say whether we have influence or not. But certainly in Malaysia, you know that given the freedom, half the freedom, people are willing to listen. And I remember when I campaigned for the opposition candidate, although the seat is Islamic Party seat versus the ruling party candidate, I told them that we support this because of our belief in democracy, in freedom, against corruption and abuse of power. We support this Malay Muslim candidate because he will speak on behalf of the Muslims and the Chinese and the Indians and the Christians and the Hindus. I mean, this was said in front of more than 10,000 crowd, 90% are Muslims, were Muslims in Kelantan. So I think we will need to continue to have this courage to impart this sort of understanding and knowledge. But again, you cannot understand or appreciate these changes merely from the prism of the Arab experience, because I think cultural background experience is different. And Malaysia, Indonesia has always been multiracial, multicultural, multireligious. I grew up in a small town, and all my neighbors, non-Muslim, we all call them uncles and aunties. And we just grew up and subconsciously considering them part of the larger family. But this need not necessarily be the case if you grow up in a society where they are predominantly Muslims. And also, as I alluded to this 1955 elections in Indonesia, mind you, the Muslim parties, what would be termed even now as fundamentalists or Islamists, has always stood for multicultural, multi-religious, democratic Indonesia, with Islam as, of course, the religion of the state, but not an Islamic state as articulated, espoused as at present. So you have that certain experience. And you see the Caliphate movement, those who were struggling on behalf of the Caliphate, were those countries that had strong influence, Turkish influence initially. In our part of the world, we were not too supportive of the Caliphate movement because we saw the Caliphate movement with all the excesses and ruthlessness and repression. Thank you.
Over here, and then we'll go over here. First over here.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'm Sarwar Kashmiri, a fellow of the Foreign Policy Association. One small respectful disagreement with your statement about Mr. Jinnah being the most admired person among Muslims. He certainly was highly despised amongst Indian Muslims, which is the second largest Muslim population in the world. The question I have, and I've been thinking about this for a while, is I wonder if this dialogue of whether democracy is possible in Islam is really the wrong dialogue to have, and whether the dialogue should be that the realities of foreign policy will not permit that. And let me try and explain what I mean. If you look at Jordan, the king of Jordan seems to have no interest whatsoever in promoting democracy in Jordan. He seems to be going in reverse. We certainly would not do anything to discourage him from that regard. You look at Oman and Abu Dhabi, very strong military bases. They have no intention of promoting democracy, not because the people may not want it, but because the power structure would not. And certainly our foreign policy would not permit that. And you can go on from there to Saudi Arabia and so on. So my question is, I just wonder whether you'd engage that as I go through this trying thought process of clarification, whether this is the wrong dialogue to have. I mean, Muslims, you know, you look at the Muslim community in India. It's been democratic and they vote and nobody really thinks twice about that. Is this a wrong dialogue to have, whether Islam and democracy are compatible? Are we doing ourselves a disservice by that?
Well, first, a small point in Jinnah. I agree with you that many Indian Muslims despise him, but not on his views on democracy and reform. It is a political decision that he had to establish a separate state, and therefore they felt